Hello and welcome to Recovering Community, the podcast about community, what it means, how it's formed, and how it can be rebuilt. I'm Anne Kerr from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow, and today we're talking about the wellbeing economy. And to do that, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Professor Gerry McCartney. Hi Gerry, thanks for joining us.
Hi Anne.
Gerry, you've worked in public health and know a lot about how people's well-being, how long they live, how sick they get, is not just a matter of genetics or individual choices or luck. It's to do with the communities they live in, isn't it?
Absolutely, Anne. So we talk about the social determinants of health and well-being, and that includes things like the economy, housing, transport, the jobs that people have. So it all matters when it comes to people's health and well-being.
We'll be going into these issues in more depth with you shortly, but first I'd like to introduce listeners to Katherine Trebeck. Katherine is a co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. She also set up its Scottish hub, We All Scotland, and is really at the forefront of changing the conversation about what the economy is for. I began by asking Katherine, what is the wellbeing economy?
So for me, the idea of a wellbeing economy is essentially flipping on its head how we understand the role of the economy and its relationship to society and to our planetary health. And traditionally, in the last few years, the last few decades even, often when people think about the economy, the objective has been to grow the economy bigger and bigger, and often that's measured by gross domestic product, either seen as an objective in its own right, just automatically assuming that that's a good thing, or out of an assumption that if we grow the economy bigger, all else that we want will automatically follow from that. And yet the reality is we have plenty of evidence that all else doesn't automatically lead to poverty reduction, to dignified lives, to quality jobs, to planetary health. And so the wellbeing economy is about asking some harder questions about the role of the economy, thinking about perhaps even repositioning it as in service of higher order goals that we've described perhaps as social justice on a healthy planet, and saying the economy should not be seen as a goal in its own right, but as something that needs to be designed and structured and purposed in a way to deliver what people and planet really need. It's essentially about making sure the economy serves humanity rather than the other way around.
And in terms of community, as you know, this series is about recovering community, recovering the idea of community, but also communities in recovery after periods of blight and neglect. What does the wellbeing economy bring to that?
I mean, if you look at the way the economy has treated individuals and communities over the last few decades, it's essentially seen human beings as what I describe as factors of production, almost treated as just-in-time inventory, literally on demand at the click of an app, as we see with the gig economy jobs. And that has come with a whole lot of damaging effects. We see people feeling disconnected from each other, not feeling hopeful about their futures, feeling stressed, feeling they don't have time to do what's most important to them, feeling anxious about their ability to put food on the table for their family. If we look at the root causes of that, we can find ourselves facing how the economy is structured, who's winning and who's losing out of it. And so that's about saying, what sort of economy do we need for communities to thrive? So this is questions about what sort of businesses need to operate in localities, how do we design the physical structure of our neighbourhoods, what sort of public transport is about, is local services affordable, accessible, designed in a way that people want and need, is there spaces for people to hang out together, just to be communities, or are they just pushed towards more and more consumption-orientated activities? Do people have enough time? So what sort of jobs are they able to get? Are there jobs that they have to work 3 or 4 jobs just to put food on the table? Or are they jobs that enable them to balance other priorities in their lives? So all those questions relate to how the economy is structured, and they all impinge on the ability of communities to thrive and to create the sort of futures that they want.
And does that change the way that communities engage with economic priorities and development in their locale, or even wider afield if you think about community in a broader sense? Are we asking communities to do more to make the wellbeing economy a success?
I think it's almost about putting communities at the heart of economic decisions and economic decision making, and making sure that the economy serves what communities want rather than the other way around. So things like participatory budgeting is a really good example of the sort of practical ways of putting people at the forefront of decision making around the economy. And so it's really about sort of returning and realigning economies with what people and planet need.
One of the issues with community involvement at that level is who represents the community, and how to make sure that it's diverse and inclusive. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's one of the challenges that often when, say, consultation processes or decision-making fora are opened up and set up, often the people who are at the forefront of those conversations are those who are in a position to be at the front of the queue. So they have spare time, for example, to engage. They have the confidence to make their voice heard. They have the communication style that's familiar to people running a consultation exercise. For example, there's all sorts of hidden barriers as well. If you can't get childcare, if you can't get transport, it's going to be very hard to take part in those dialogues. And let's, there are dialogues out there, but they're often not open enough, and they often don't take account of those barriers to participation and engagement. And I think the more that people are attentive to the reality of people's lives, the more they make the effort to go to where people are rather than passively expecting people to come to them, the more we'll start to close some of those gaps and have a richer variety of voices and ideas and expertise at the heart of those conversations.
And we do also have a history of initiatives where people probably do feel on balance that they weren't listened to, and that was one of the things I wanted to talk to you about too. Some communities in some areas where there is an ongoing long-term challenge with poverty or with inequality have been consulted a lot by lots of different agencies over quite a long period of time, and they've become a bit beleaguered by being asked to be involved and maybe a bit cynical about what the outcome might be. Do you think there's a danger for wellbeing economy that would repeat itself again?
I mean, I think if consultation is done flippantly, if it's done insincerely, if it's done just to tick a box and to be able to say that consultation happened, if it's done not to actually set the agenda, but just to ask for a bit of input on some of the details, and if it's done in a way that doesn't recognise that people's time is precious. I mean, I think it's not good enough to go out and ask people for, say, a couple of hours of their time to input into a conversation around an academic research project or a policy dialogue, for example. I mean, 2 hours of people's time is not an inconsiderable amount of their day. And so I think we should be recognising the imbalance of resources and power that's inherent in that. I think we should recognise that people giving up that time should be compensated. So perhaps remunerating people or finding other ways to recognise the gift of their time that they've contributed. And I think it's those measures, it's how we do it that I think will matter. I think also people will see through insincere consultation that they know won't make a difference. And I think that one of the key aspects that I think Scotland and the policy world and the academic world can get a lot better at is circling back to communities and saying, okay, here's what we heard from you, here's the difference that made.
And government too have got barriers that they've got to overcome to facilitate this too. I mean, government at all sorts of different levels. And one of the criticisms is that they're sometimes too tentative and they're not prepared to take risks as much as we would perhaps like to see that bigger change, and that it's too incremental and it's too rooted in cost benefit analysis that are based on old economic models. How do we get from there to a more radical, challenging agenda for wellbeing economy?
I think that's a great question, and I love the original meaning of the word radical is about getting to the root causes of a problem, and I think that is where Scotland needs to go. So often this debate around social policy in Scotland is stuck around what I describe as putting sticking plasters over a problem. We celebrate when we slightly redistribute from richer to poorer. Lately, the big discussion has been around increasing child poverty payments, as if that is a success in itself. I think the fact that we're having to pay child poverty payments is a dire indictment of the way the economy is operating. And so, in a way, I think it's time that Scotland raised its gaze and was more ambitious than just putting sticking plasters on the current problems. What we need to be doing is not just playing whack-a-mole, but look at the machine that's generating so much of the damage. And that comes back to how the economy is structured, who's winning and who's losing out of that. It's a question not just about, in a way, servicing the problems of that economy, paying to treat the collateral damage of the current system, but actually looking at questions of power, of ownership, of those deep-rooted inequalities. And so that conversation requires government to operate in quite different ways. It requires government to team up across departments, across silos, to recognise the interconnected nature of problems, but also the multiple benefits that you can achieve when you really think more broadly. It requires budgets to be long-term and policy making to be long-term rather than year on year. And it requires us to think very differently about questions of, who is owning the businesses? What sort of business models do we have in an economy? How are they designed? What's even the very measure of progress of the economy? So these are quite fundamental questions. I don't think Scotland is by any means incapable of asking these questions. And it's, I think, really healthy that there are these discussions happening. I don't think we're seeing yet enough initiatives going far enough, and we're certainly not seeing them joined up in a way. So there's lots of nice practice that we could point to that illustrate the sort of changes that we would need to build a wellbeing economy, but they're not yet connected up in a way that adds up to a fundamental shift in the way the economy operates. We need a policy regime that orientates towards those sorts of activities rather than those that are counter to what people on planet need.
Gerry, it was really inspiring to talk with Katherine about how to make a positive difference to our social and economic lives by focusing on what works for communities and really keeping them at the centre of those discussions and initiatives.
So another important aspect, Anne, I think, is about the nature of work and how that's changed over the last 10 or 20 years. Do you have any views about precarious work, for example?
I think it's a running theme in a lot of what Katherine was pointing to, really, about how the kinds of work that's on offer these days doesn't actually give people a decent wage to live on, but it creates an incredible amount of insecurity, which makes it difficult for families, individuals and communities to thrive. But there are alternative ways of working, as we know. So I guess my question to you would be, could you give us any examples of better ways of working that are actually part of what a wellbeing economy would look like?
So there's a great example of the wellbeing economy in action, if you like, in the East End of Glasgow. Green City Whole Foods is a wholesaler co-op that was founded by 4 friends in 1978, and they just wanted to make whole foods available to everyone. But today it's a thriving ethical business. Last year, indeed, their turnover was over £9 million. Everyone at Green City earns the same salary, workers vote on the running of the company, and it plays a great part in the lives of many of Scotland's most successful sustainable producers and businesses, from farms to coffee shops.
Oh, well, this is the main warehouse at Green City, and here is where we keep most of our kind of fast-moving goods. So as you can see, lots of...
So I went down to Denniston to meet Lee Galletley, who works in Green City Whole Foods HR department, and Babs McGregor, who works in the warehouse.
This is where I work 4 days a week as a receiver on goods in, but also you'll see around me here there are people picking, so they'll be going on goods out.
Babs has been at Green City for 22 years, and I asked her how the co-op has evolved over that time.
We have, I suppose, increased rather organically, over the years. We started off with 4 members, and now in 2022 we have 55. So that's maybe not massive growth, but for us that growth has been organic, and it's moved at the pace it's needed to move at to meet the needs of the business and the individuals concerned, the members of the business. It's a business that's run and controlled by its members. We have no distant shareholders who basically benefit from the sweat of our labour, and we put back surplus into developing the company.
Brilliant. And Lee, you were talking about you'd worked in other places before and you've come to work in a workers' co-op now. What's the similarities and differences of working in a place like this?
I think the similarities are, obviously we function operationally like many other businesses. We have similar departments, we have to make the same types of decisions. The difference is the non-hierarchical nature of our workplace, so people do have to be self-managing to a certain degree. We're all accountable to each other. We do have department managers, but they are elected for the co-op, by the co-op, to work for the co-op. So we always say manager is a role, not a status. And they sort of coordinate and speak for each department at meetings and things. And but for bigger decisions, we use the full members. But I would say the largest difference possibly is a sense of freedom.
Okay.
Freedom over your own working life, freedom to feed into decisions, and even though we have to collectively agree to make our decisions, and it might not always go the way that you want it to go, you've at least had an input into the process and had your voice heard.
So you can probably hear in the background that we're outside the warehouse at the moment, and you were talking earlier on about some of the aspects about working here are quite different from other workplaces. So Babs, you were talking about the choice of music. Do you want to tell us just a bit about what it's like working in the warehouse?
Oh yeah, the warehouse is the arts faculty of Green City. That's how I would term the warehouse. It's been a real cultural learning experience, actually, working in Green City over the past 22 years for me. I've learned so much, just, culturally as well, in the broader sense of culture. In a very physical kind of grinding job that warehousing can sometimes be, music is such a powerful force to keep you going, and it's really important that you've got the right music on for the right kind of work. So yeah, my musical tastes are a lot better, that's what I think that's wonderful about a worker co-op is I think it's a way of life. It's a culture, actually, and it's a learning culture. I think that kind of culture generates a lot more empathy and understanding than you might necessarily find in more kind of, shall I say, cutthroat businesses,
So in this episode of the podcast, we're thinking about a wellbeing economy and what that might mean and how we might get there. So some people describe a wellbeing economy as being about providing work that's fulfilling and that people can enjoy and learn through it. But it's also about producing things that are of value and produce social goods and don't damage the environment. What I'm picking up from you both today is this huge enthusiasm for working here. How do you recruit people? How do people come to work here? Do they stay a long time? What's the worker experience?
Well, maybe Lee, you could talk about recruitment.
Recruiting now, we made a decision to try and we don't use recruitment agencies at all. So now we tend to advertise on our social media. So people who already follow us as a business will then see that the jobs are available. And so you're attracting people who hopefully will have skills for that job, but are also interested in working in a co-op environment. As for longevity and how long people stay, the majority of people stay a very long time. Our turnover is very low. A lot of people have been here for a very long time, which is great because it's sort of like a family. But then you do have other problems maybe later on down the line of maybe an ageing workforce, once everyone starts getting a bit older. So we're keen to keep growing, keep attracting people, and we're also keen to retain the people we have and hopefully just organically, as people retire or dropping hours or days maybe as they get a little bit older. So that's enabling us to backfill those positions with other people. So that's creating a more rounded workforce, at this point.
So another feature, obviously, of a workers' co-op is that there isn't a big boss or a big owner who's extracting profits from the system. So what does that mean for this community?
If we make a profit, it would go into the pockets of the workers. If we do have a successful quarter, we get paid a dividend payment on top of our normal salary, and additional money from that quarter will be retained for developing the business itself.
Great. The model that you've created here at Green City is so impressive, but clearly the majority of Glasgow's economy is still operating in the traditional capitalist mode. What more could we do to encourage and support the creation of more workers' co-ops in the city?
Well, Cooperative Development Scotland could probably do a lot more than they're actually doing to support that. I think their focus has been a lot on employee ownership, which isn't quite the same thing as a worker co-op. It's kind of worker co-op light. That's how I describe employee ownership.
What would you say the differences are?
Well, in employee ownership, say like some place say like, well, I'm thinking of maybe John Lewis and partnerships, but it's not one member, one vote. this is the thing, every member at Green City has a vote, and most decisions, you need to have members, a certain majority in Green City has to pass before, decisions are actually approved and can go ahead. Whereas I think with employee ownership, employees will have certain rights, and I think that's far better than your usual capitalist model. But they're still not sufficient for me, still not enough. And I do think what's interesting now, actually, on the ground, is you're seeing, actually coming through COVID, there's a lot of younger people starting off businesses. We've had a lot of wee bakeries coming on our customer base. You've got young people with vision, and you've got young people with a desire to work, but on their terms. So I do think that this is time where really more help should be there from both Co-ops UK, the Apex organisation, and Co-op Development Scotland.
I'd like to add, especially Babs was saying there about young people setting up their businesses. I've certainly noticed in some of the younger people we have at Green City, they have moved so far away from sort of, if you want to call it the Thatcher model of work really hard, really hard, get lots of money, buy a house, do this, keep progressing, keep getting promoted, to, yes, everyone needs a certain amount of money to live, and money is still important, but the money is much less of a driving factor than their life and how they want to live their life. And they would rather, say, for instance, work 4 days a week as opposed to 5 to have that extra day of flexibility, which does not at all mean they bring less to their work. In some ways, I think it means they bring more, because they are happy in their life and they're happy with the balance that they've had. And I think that's really admirable, and something certainly that my generation and generations above were not really told about those values. The worker co-op model is still so alien to most people. Most people I speak to don't know what it is, they don't understand it, and when you try and explain it to them, they're going, well, how does that work? Well, how do you progress? How do you move on? They don't understand progressing unless it's in terms of a pay rise or a vertical promotion.
And obviously it's a competitive global environment and global economy that we're working in, and some people are very sceptical of workers' co-ops or different ways of running the economy. How do you manage to compete and find this niche to thrive as a business?
I think it's because, over the years we've really prioritised relationships with our customers. So we're not just talking about transactions here, we're talking about Green City as a relational business. So all these businesses, usually small, wee independents initially, our initial customers were small independent health food stores, and basically one of the main aims of Green City initially was basically to improve people's access to whole foods, because they were quite hard to come by. Our business demographic has changed over the years, so now it incorporates restaurants, hotels, cafe bars, the growing plant-based vegan movement. Glasgow's, I think, we're the leading city in the UK for vegan food. So, yeah, it's relationships building. That's what we're about, and that's what our customers know about us. And, we're known, we're loved, and we're trusted.
Gerry, it sounds like you had a really terrific visit to Green City Whole Foods. Could you just tell us about how you felt when you came away from that visit?
You're right, Anne. It was a truly inspiring visit. What Green City do is the embodiment of what we're thinking about in terms of a wellbeing economy. They provide fulfilling, happy work for people, good wages. They are the embodiment of economic democracy in action. They also have a supply chain that feeds Glasgow with healthy foods. They support ecological and ethical suppliers, and they frankly are hugely involved within the local community of Glasgow. They have links to existing campaigns and community organisations. They've got an active Gaelic language learning set within the warehouse, and it just seemed to be a great fun place to be and to work. People were listening to their own music. There was lots of banter across the warehouse. People clearly got on and stayed there for a long time. So yeah, an awe-inspiring example.
So it's a really good example of what the wellbeing economy can mean, because it's about work and the nature of work, but it's also about planetary health and sustainability, given that it's whole foods that is being produced and sold by the co-op. Do you think that means it's a really good example of this sort of radical hope that Katherine was talking about in her discussion of wellbeing economy?
Absolutely. It's literally the embodiment of what the kind of economy we need to build for the future. So it does achieve social outcomes. It is supporting people's health. It is achieving that move towards living within our planetary boundaries. But on a more human level, it was just such a fun place to be around. People were chatting, people were having fun at work. There was great music playing in the warehouse. The sights and the smells and the banter that was present within the co-op was obvious for everybody to see. And it just looked like a great place to work and be. And it's also really connected into the local community. So they have been building artist studios for people to come and do recordings in some of the spare space that they had. They're involved in local community action. They're involved in other voluntary networks across the city like Gal Gale. And so it's a real asset for the city that's built on community action and built on people sort of making things as good as they can for themselves.
Well, thanks so much, Gerry, for joining me today to talk about this. I think it's been a great set of discussions really about what a positive community-led or worker-led kind of recovery would mean. So certainly very clearly within the core theme of our podcast series, Recovering Community.
It's been my pleasure, and thanks to Katherine Trebeck for her help with the podcast, and Babs and Lee from Green City, who took time out to show us around Green City and to make this episode possible.
Thanks, Gerry. If you have any thoughts or feedback about this or any of our other episodes, you can find us on Twitter at UofGSPS, or you can find the School of Social and Political Sciences via the University of Glasgow website. And if you've enjoyed the series, please do subscribe and share. I'm Anne Kerr. Many thanks for listening to Recovering Community.
And I'm Gerry McCartney. You can find me on Twitter or on the University of Glasgow website.
Thanks also to the staff in the School of Social and Political Sciences and the College of Social Sciences who helped with this project. Recovering Community is produced by Freya Hellier.